So welcome to Technicon. My name is Marco. I'm with Plus Plus and with Technicon, one of the original organizers of it. Today we're going to have Dion and Joel talk to us about a continuous improvement with a focus on engineering learning. Before we introduce them, I just want to give you a little bit of a how to participate. So feel free. So we're back to Slack. We experimented with other. Zoom. We experimented with some other platforms. So feel free to use the chat feature. If you have any questions, comments, feel free to chat to everyone. We're observing that, and we are going to. I'll bring them up as when the time is right for questions, so that we can address them and answer them. If you have any technical issues, feel free to ping Tomomi directly. She's online. And yeah, well, we'll start with that. In addition to today's talk, we also have our community on LinkedIn. We have a community on technicon.io. This is the official website, as well as Twitter. So with that, a little bit of a history. And I think Joel was just asking me about this. So we started in person back in a day. So 2018, a couple of us that were basically had the responsibility of engineering education at various Silicon Valley companies decided to get together and create a one-day conference. So in 2018, we did this at LinkedIn. So Rajan, I just saw, joined the talk. Rajan, myself, and Jenny were the original organizers, and Rajan was at LinkedIn, and LinkedIn sponsored the event. And it was just a fabulous full day mini conference. In 2019, we repeated that at Twitter, and it was also pretty awesome. And then the pandemic happened. So since then, we've been meeting online. So the newer edition is in the format that you're seeing today. So basically, pretty much every month we do one of these talks. Between the talks, we have a Slack channel. So if you are not part of that, feel free to join. Tomomi just posted in the chat how to. So join the Slack channel, and you can interact with the folks, your peers, between the roundtables that we organize monthly. Behind the scenes, there's a group of us that helps organize this. It's the Technicon board. I saw Andrew join, Rajan as well, I mentioned already, and so a couple other folks there. And I mentioned Tomomi does all the heavyweight lifting behind the scenes. So that's how we do what we do. We have a little bit of a community guidelines, and this is mostly to protect the space and make sure that this is a safe place to interact with your peers. So essentially it says, do the right thing. And if you're not sure what it is, check out the guidelines, and it's all posted online as well. So with that, before we jump into today's talk, I just want to do a pitch for April talks. In April, we're going to hear from Salesforce, and they're going to be talking about how they scale their new technical hire onboarding. And so Ashley Austin is going to be doing a spiel on that. So stay tuned. And if you join the mailing list or Slack channel, you'll find out about all these upcoming events as well. So with that, and there's also a link where you can directly sign up. Tomomi just posted in the chat. So with that, just really quickly, the community Technicon started to support primarily technical education, technical onboarding, knowledge sharing, peer and collaborative learning, mentorship, coaching, documentation, and insights at companies where there's a lot of technical folks. So that's kind of how we started, and what our sort of charter is. We created sort of like an umbrella of all these different initiatives. We call that team enablement. And essentially, it's the things that a typical organization needs to do to make sure that their people can do their best job. And there are a number of different initiatives underneath that umbrella. And today we'll be talking about some of those initiatives as well. So with that, I just wanted to introduce Dion and Joel. I met them a while back. We got introduced through Ray Kung, who actually spoke at one of the very first Technicon conferences back in 2018. And I believe Ray worked with Dion and Joel at Atlassian on up-leveling their engineering practices. And so that's how we met. We met when they came up with a book around the dojo concept. And today they have some new ideas, but it's all in the spirit of how do we make our developers more effective, so developer productivity, and also how do we be more agile as teams, and what kind of learning and knowledge management, knowledge transfer best practices can be apply, so that everyone's got a shared understanding, so that together as a team we can run faster and do better things. So with that, I'm going to pass it on to Joel and Dion.
All right. Thanks for the introduction, Marco. Joel and I are really happy to be here. We feel like we've got a lot in common with the TechnoCon community. Those goals under team enablement, they could more or less be our mission statement as well. We are all about helping organizations develop and improve existing capabilities, and that usually means upskilling at the team level. So we have been doing this dojo coaching thing for almost 10 years now. I'm not going to talk too much about the dojo model. You can read about that on our website. If you have questions, I can try to answer them in Slack. Joel can try to answer them in the Slack workspace. What I want to talk about today is sort of the lessons we've learned from operating dojos for about 10 years. And if we had to try and distill kind of the essence of what makes the dojo model work so it could be applied and other models could be created from it. That's really the goal of today. I want to ground things by talking a little bit about where we're coming from. I know with this particular crowd, I don't need to say much because we're all familiar with this landscape, right? We've all been part of one or more of these initiatives within our organizations over the last several years. Sadly, a lot of these initiatives have failed, and I think we're seeing a backlash against some of these, particularly Agile. And stakeholders are asking what value they received for their investment. Rightly so. A lot of these initiatives at various organizations have not led to anywhere near the promised outcomes. Unfortunately, instead of saying, why didn't these initiatives work? What went wrong? And I'm not talking about just getting to an answer of, well, you didn't do it right. You know, it's going a little bit more deeper than that. But instead of really looking at organizations and L&D from sort of a systems perspective, I think we just said, well, these all failed. And now we're just moving on to the next thing, which is developer productivity. Marco even sort of called that out, right? So instead of doing an analysis and real reflection, we're just on to the next thing. And while we're onto this, we're all expected to do this in today's business environment while we're cutting costs. Just listen to earnings reports for any publicly traded company over the last 6 months to a year, and you're almost guaranteed to hear the phrase cutting costs somewhere in the report out that they're doing to shareholders and interesting parties. So we failed, we're on to dev productivity, but we have to implement dev productivity while we're cutting costs. It's a pretty tough situation to be in. Also want to talk about this, what we're going to get into in terms of the essence of what we think leads to real continuous improvement and learning by grounding it a little bit in systems theory or systems thinking. This is a white paper that Joel and I refer to very frequently. Nobody ever gets credit for fixing problems that never happened. The white paper lays out a systems diagram, which we've captured the final diagram here. The white paper is worth reading. It kind of builds this diagram up step by step. The way to look at this, though, is if you look at something like performance gap, the middle circle over on the right there, If we look at the circles that are connected to it, actual performance and desired performance, we're looking at really the correlation there, right? So when actual performance is not where we want it to be, that is an increase in the performance gap, right? So a negative sign on here is inversely correlated. When desired performance goes up, the performance gap goes up as well. One thing that's really important when we're looking at systems diagrams is we look for loops. So there is a loop from performance gap to pressure to do work to time spent working to actual performance. So when actual performance goes up, to clarify what I was saying previously, it does actually diminish the performance gap, right? So makes sense. When performance goes up, the performance gap goes down. And that loop will work for a period of time in reducing what is a perceived performance gap. Sadly, I think a lot of the developer productivity efforts that are being launched are really within that loop right now. They're trying to figure out how we get more out of people. How can we spend more time spent working? Even in the most altruistic view of things, where we're not asking people to work a bunch of overtime hours, there's this mentality, especially with engineering teams, that if we can just reduce everything that's not coding and increase the time spent working coding, that's going to lead to performance improvement, which we think is highly questionable. The other loop here, if you start at performance gap again and follow the bottom arrow over to pressure to improve capability, there is a pressure when a performance gap exists that can lead to time spent on improvement. The problem is there's always a delay whenever we spend time on improvement before that capability really does increase. And it's only really by improving the capability that we actually, on a long-term basis, can increase actual performance. So there's constant pressure not to spend time on improving, especially in light of the fact that there's a delay there, so we don't see results immediately. What I'm going to talk about next are the essential principles that we think can help make sure that any time we spend on improvement actually does lead to capability improvement. And these can be applied at any scale. So the dojo model, some of you may have heard, we talked here once before. The basic model is a 6-week learning experience. We've applied these principles on shorter durations, so week-long learning experiences, for example. So let me get into the principles. These are the 7 right here. I would encourage you all, even if you are somewhat skeptical of anything we're saying today, just as a thought experiment, look at your own improvement efforts, your coaching efforts, your continuous improvement efforts. Kind of go through this as a checklist even and say, are we meeting this particular principle? And if not, what could we do differently? And what might that lead to in terms of outcomes? That's an exercise a lot of other people have found value in doing. So I'm going to go through these pretty quickly. I think many of them are self-explanatory. The first one is focus on learning over delivery. So for a period of time, whether that's 6 weeks, 1 week, 1 hour, the focus really does need to be on learning over delivery. Sadly, a lot of us as coaches get pulled into coaching engagements where bottom line is we're really there to help the team deliver on time or faster or with higher quality. And the focus is not on learning. By focusing on learning, if you're there with the team for a short time, you're going to leave the team with improved capability. Whereas if you're focused on delivery, the capability might not improve at all, even if you are successful on the delivery outcomes you are shooting for. We think it's critical that teams learn collaboratively together. So a lot of typical approaches to training are workshops. I'm sure all of you have been in some organization where someone has said, we're going to send 1 or 2 people from a team to a workshop, and they are responsible for spreading the knowledge that they learn or obtain in that workshop to the rest of the team when they get back. One of the main techniques we use for this is software teaming. Woody Zuhl is one of the first people behind this. It started at Hunter Industries. You may have heard of this as mob programming or ensemble programming. These are all different names for the same thing. But we found this to be a really effective capability improvement tool. And it's not only for programming. We've had teams use this approach to do sprint planning, collaborative design work, pretty much anything where we say we're going to bring together a group of people to do collaborative work. A large part of this is based on Llewellyn Falco's golden rule of pairing. And what Llewellyn states is for an idea to go from your head into the computer, it must go through someone else's hands. So if Joel and I are working on something together, if I have the idea, I express that idea out loud verbally to Joel, I give him instructions, and he implements the idea. The person implementing the idea, who's also known as the driver, does not decide what to do. They are simply following instructions. And there's a lot of really great results and repercussions that happen when teams work in this way. By having the person with the idea verbalize it and enforcing this rule that someone else has to understand that idea to be able to get it in the computer, it generally means that we're forcing everyone on the team to be in a similar situation in terms of developing understanding, right? That person who's driving, there's these two roles, driver and navigator. The person who's driving has to think out loud and give instructions. Even when they aren't clear exactly on what the next step is, one of the guidelines we give them is to think out loud. So even if you're doing design work or designing a system and not actually writing the code at that point in time, by expressing the thought process that someone is going through, other people can learn not only how to implement what they want when we finally get to that decision, but how they get to that decision in the first place. That can be really, really valuable. The other thing I'll say about this, Tomomi and I and the rest of us were chatting briefly, and the whole topic of zoomed out or Zoom fatigue came up. And in my experience, I don't think people are burnt out on working collaboratively over Zoom. I think they're burned out on bad meetings over Zoom. And we've actually seen teams feel energized after working in this style together over Zoom. One team that I worked with, we were scheduled to do this 3 hours a day. I would log off at the end of the 3-hour session. And then I learned a couple days later that they were getting back on after a lunch break and doing another 3 to 4 hours of this style of work because they found it so effective. Okay. Next principle, ground learning in the context of real world work. I'm sure all of you have seen Bloom's taxonomy before. A lot of the knowledge and information that has been made explicit out there, so it's been written down or captured in some form, we can easily get to those first two bottom levels of learning, right? We can remember, we can understand. I can read something, I can understand it. It doesn't necessarily mean I can apply it. A lot of our typical improvement efforts, we do get into that apply space, but often we're working on exercises. And again, from our experience in the dojo over the last 10 years, we find the learning sticks much more when people apply it to their real world work. And that includes facing all the constraints that they have to deal with in their real world work. A lot of the times, exercises and training programs don't have the real world constraints that people face when they get back to their desks. So this learning in the context of real world work is really important. I think people also just care about it more when they know they can immediately apply it to what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. I kind of mentioned explicit knowledge. Tacit knowledge is the other type of knowledge here. This definition of tacit knowledge comes from commoncog.com. There are a lot of really interesting articles and blogs that are there. I would encourage you all to check it out. The owner of that site defines tacit knowledge as knowledge that cannot be captured through words alone. I think that's a really good definition. This is where working in a group, in a team, with a coach, this type of tacit knowledge, this is how we think you can foster an environment where it will be exchanged or created. I think there's also a really interesting implication here for AI, or at least large language models. All of us are wrestling with the question of how is AI going to impact our jobs? How can we use it? But if tacit knowledge is really knowledge that cannot be captured through words alone, at least when we're looking at LLMs, the thought exercise I'm doing is, does that mean an LLM can never be capable of absorbing tacit knowledge, let alone helping other people create that type of knowledge? I think there's some interesting implications there, and some of the hype around AI, I think if they were to consider that question, people might be coming to different conclusions. Okay, we want to make learning holistic and span multiple practices. Rather than teach a specific single practice like test-driven development or domain-driven design or a single technique like that, we find it's better when we work with teams over a longer period of time and we're addressing multiple practices along the way. If we can get engineers participating in product discovery to see what kind of questions come up in the product discovery process before delivery, and help them learn how developing a pipeline where they can deploy quickly to a small group of customers or users to get feedback on whether a capability or feature in their product is valuable or not. When they see that whole end-to-end process, light bulbs start going off, and they not only learn the practices, but they learn the value behind the practices and how they feed into each other. The next principle is provide assessment, feedback, and coaching. I think this is pretty self-explanatory. Emily Bates is a really great technical coach. She runs the site Saman Coaching, has a lot in common with the dojo model. In our opinion, the problem with learning right now is not a lack of content. There is a ton of content out there. A lot of it's free on YouTube. The problem isn't a lack of content. It is this need for assessment, feedback, and coaching as people are consuming the content to make sure they're getting to that apply stage and even the higher stages in Bloom's taxonomy. We want to provide sufficient time for repetitive practice. So going all the way back to the late 1800s, Hermann Ebbinghaus came up with this forgetting curve and theory of learning that basically says without intentional repetition over time, people will forget something they learn in a 1 or 2 day workshop. They'll forget about 90% of it within 30 days. So the idea is you have to put these ideas into practice. You have to put your learning into practice. And it's not just going through an exercise once, even if you're successful at completing that exercise, it is this repetitive practice. Okay, the final principle that I want to talk about is ensuring learner safety. This was even in the comments that Marco was talking about in terms of kind of the guidelines for how this community operates together. So I'm sure this is not new to any of you. This model might be new. Dr. Timothy Clark, it basically says there's sort of like a bowling lane where you can go outside the rails if you're not careful. So there's a balance between respect and permission. And a lot of respect without giving people permission to fail and learn leads to paternalism. A lot of permission without really respecting people and really giving them autonomy leads to exploitation. He also describes 4 levels of psychological safety. And we feel like if you don't get to the upper levels, that you're not really going to create an environment that fosters learning. Okay, at this point, I'm going to turn things over to Joel to talk about if we are implementing some kind of learning program that follows these 7 principles, how do we go about measuring our effectiveness of the learning program?
Yeah, thanks, Deanne. So what we can see here is whenever we start with any organization, the first thing we're looking for is the outcomes an organization is looking for. If you think about that capability, that performance gap that Deanne showed early on, we're trying to understand what's the performance gap that organizations are having. The reason being is that we want to be able to correlate improvement in skills and capabilities to reduction in the performance gap. So we use that that performance gap and where the organization is trying to go as a foundation, and then we actually work with the teams. And we talk with, when we're starting to engage with the teams, we want to understand what skills do they have that impacts those capabilities? What's easy for them to achieve as a team? What's difficult for them to achieve as a team? And so as a team, we help them collect the skills that they want to be proficient at, and of course, who on the team has it. Really simple. Typically what happens is teams realize just how many skills they actually need to be successful, right? It's never as simple as I just need to write some React code. There's usually a lot of other skills that influence what it takes to be successful as a team. So it's a nice visualization for teams to see how many skills they actually need. We also have the teams self-identify, or the members self-identify the skills they have and also where they want to grow. The intent isn't to say everybody has to be a master at everything, because that would be kind of silly. But we do want to make sure we don't have skill isolation. We do want to create opportunities for peer learning. And so we use this as a mechanism to see how can we create those opportunities for peer-to-peer learning. This has an interesting implication if you think back around what Dion was saying when we're talking about teams learning together and like the social aspects of learning. If we realize, like in this picture, that Aaliyah is really good at test automation, well, we want to make sure that maybe she is the navigator and she's explaining to somebody who wants to learn. Maybe she's explaining to David. And so she's externalizing how she goes about approaching test automation, so David grows the skills. Everybody else gets to benefit from them as we go. It says a really interesting, again, implication into tacit learning, externalizing your thought process. There's also, I could drop the link in here or for in Slack if anybody's interested. There was also a wonderful white paper by an assistant professor at the London School of Economics, where I forget his he goes by Ninja, but I think his full name is Naranjan something, and he talks about the effect of not cross-skilling, but cross-understanding in a team. And so when Aaliyah thinks about what good test automation looks like, does David and Jack and Reggie understand and have the same understanding of what Aaliyah thinks test automation looks like? And the implications of, do we actually have understanding of our peers, goes deep into how teams perform. So again, using this skills matrix to see who has the knowledge, who shares it, and using social learning as a way of transferring this information and finding out where our gaps are in understanding is a deeply impactful technique. Do you want the next one, Dion? There you go. When we have teams do this identification of the skills, they also do a little self-assessment. Where do they feel like they're at? We have the teams assess themselves early on, and then after we work with them. And of course, they can do this continuously. And what we're looking for, of course, is improvement in capabilities, which then lead to improvements in organizational performance. And so we're trying to create this correlation of effect here. This example is one tool that we have seen that does this in an interesting way. This example from a company called Learning ROI actually looks at the social aspects and the team aspects of learning. Now, you can see that the first two might be pretty self-explanatory. So cross-functional, how well do we have the skills across the team? Is the team set up for success for the skills that they need? The depth index, when we have complicated problems, how deep are our skills to solve complicated problems in a particular skill? Those are pretty self-explanatory, but again, we're looking at this at a team level because, let's be honest, software is created by teams. The last aspect I think is super interesting is Learning ROI goes into this idea of a diffusion index. The diffusion index measures if, in essence, the gap in our teams from like the most proficient in our teams to like the lowest proficient in our teams. So we might have all the skills, right? We might be cross-functional. We have all the skills in the team. We might be proficiently have experience and depth in parts of the skills, but how equally distributed are those skills? Diffusion index is something that we try and grow on teams, because if you have a low diffusion index, what that actually means is even on a team, you have skill isolation. You have one person who's really good at React, and you have one person that's really good at API design, and one person that's really good at the data. And so you have all the skills and you have depth in them, but the skills are not equally distributed across the team. When that happens, when the skills are not equally distributed across the teams, you create in-team silos based upon skills and capabilities. It means we defer decisions to one person. Only the architect can make that decision because they understand the ramifications. Only the data person on our team will make those decisions. You also have implicit or accidental bottlenecks within your team. To deliver software takes the whole team approach. But if you have all the skills in your team, but they're not equally distributed, you have kind of batch and wait for the skill on your team. And so we look at how do we go about increasing the diffusion of skills on the team, because we've found that correlates to improvements in capabilities and better outcomes for organizations. And the last thing about diffusion, which I think is super interesting, is that diffusion through Learning ROI's kind of data, they've been able to make a loose correlation with burnout, which again, loose correlation, kind of take it for what it's worth. But if you think about what diffusion means, if Dion is the only person that can do React and I'm the only person that does the microservices and we have to kind of work back and forth together, if the next initiative has a lot of work for Dion, he's going to get stressed out because not anybody else can do it. And so he's working extra hours and he's getting burned out. So we've seen this interesting correlation with burnout and diffusion. So again, these are just kind of the areas that we've been looking at. Yeah, great point from Dion. We do anonymize this, so we don't really know kind of who's what. We look at it at team level. So again, we're trying to correlate skills to capabilities to organizational outcomes. Next slide, Dion. I would think this was new to me. We just heard about this a few years back, but it seems to be pretty common in the L&D space, this idea of the Kirkpatrick model of learning. In essence, the 4 levels. Did the learners like the training? Did they learn something? Did it change behavior? Did it actually have an impact? What we are fundamentally going for is that we're trying to change behavior in a team, which leads to impacts inside of an organization. I think if we're not doing that, we're just kind of doing disservice, not only to the people, but also to the organization. Ultimately, if we agree that there's a performance gap, we want to improve capabilities, we got to change behaviors and we got to have an impact from the results that we do. If you take the Kirkpatrick model into consideration, then when you're thinking about what success looks like from training initiatives is going to be drastically different. It's not about how many people completed the class. It's not about an NPS score for the professor or the teacher in the class. It's about something a little bit more. In these examples up here, we've been trying to help organizations get to better measurements for the impacts of their learning initiatives. Ideally, we get teams kind of on the far right there. Are they able to reduce the amount of time it takes to get a feature out that actually matters, right? Not opposed to not just reducing cycle time, which is wonderful in the engineering space, but also making sure that those things that are being delivered actually matter. And so we just start with this idea of thinking about how do we get to more impactful measurements. That's fundamentally where we're trying to get to. If we can't get there, then sometimes we start a little bit further to the left, reduction of cycle time, right? If we can't get a reduction of cycle time, then maybe it is something around reduction of defects. But again, we're trying to get impacts and results and not just kind of level 1, level 2 kind of results from what the initiatives we're taking on. And then this is where it gets fun. I made a horrible joke pre-COVID. So like 2015, 2016, I was at an Agile meetup and I made a comment that if people working in Agile didn't understand distribution and variance, then they shouldn't be worrying about velocity. Where that comes back to here is this. This is an example of a Shewhart chart, also called a process control chart, a behavior chart. They have a variety of names. In essence, what these charts say is that there is normal variation in how we go about delivering software. In a systems diagram, there's normal variation. Now, we could be measuring the amount of defects per release. We could be measuring the number of features delivered per time frame. We could be measuring the amount of uptime. But regardless, we would agree that there is going to be natural variation. Sometimes we get more, sometimes we get less. The risk we have is that we overreact to things that are normal variation. So in this example with this drawing here, you could see on day 11, we had this spike. Maybe on day 11, there was a lot of defects or a lot of downtime or a lot of features got shipped. If we don't understand the normal variance, then we overreact to noise. This is where, in addition with this, if we are doing an initiative to improve capabilities, we should be able to see correlation to an impact and an outcome. If we're helping teams learn better testing practices, we're helping engineers learn test-driven development. If the working theory is that by doing that, we are going to reduce defects, then we should be able to have a process control chart that shows when the technique was introduced, and we should see, statistically speaking, that the defects are going down, the downtime is going down, or the stability is going up, or whatever we choose to measure. But if we can't have some statistical analysis or some level of confidence that the changes we're doing are actually making a difference, then we start to get into just kind of change theater, right? We're doing all these initiatives because somebody said they were a good idea. Dion and I don't like copying processes. We like helping people and knowing it makes a difference. And so this is fundamentally what we're using. We're trying to find performance gap to capabilities, to skills, to helping people make it learn these skills in a social manner and proving that it makes a difference. If we can't prove it makes a difference, then it feels a little weird. So if you think back now, when we think about traditional training and some of these principles, as well as measuring outcomes and talking about being able to attribute it, statistically speaking, to a change in capability, and we think about traditional learnings, 2-day workshops, maybe something on Udemy or something like that, and you think about kind of how those learnings might work. You get a clean sandbox environment, everything works, right? Just follow, paint by numbers, and you'll be successful. Typically, it happens at the individual level. You don't get a lot of feedback outside of like a stack dump, right? And you learn one skill at a time. You might learn how to build containers more effectively, or how to secure them, or how to scan them. And you do this kind of as a one-off and not in the context of your work. And we're trying to figure out if traditional learning actually meets some of those principles, where it's about collaborative learning in the context of work, has an impact. Everybody gets better within the constraints of our real world work. You might say the traditional training doesn't meet a lot of those needs. So you might get to a point where the best we could do with traditional training is that we can ask them if the learners liked it, if they had a good time, and if something was interesting. But if we can't cross that chasm into our real world work with real feedback and actually showing that it has impact, statistically speaking, on outcomes for an organization, we will never get to a level 3 or level 4 in that Kirkpatrick model. We will never be able to say behaviors have changed. It has had an impact. So I'm not saying traditional learning training doesn't have any place at all. We just have to be very careful with our expectations of what we'll get out of it. Again, it all comes back to this physics of improvement. If organizations are trying to close that performance gap, spending less money while doing it, we have to have some principles in mind, not only about what we want to get out of it, and most definitely better ways of approaching it. Better ways as these principles. Learning over delivery for as much time as it can make sense. Doing it together, social, collaborative learning, because we build together. Has to be in the context of your work. Has to be multidiscipline, because disciplines and capabilities impact each other. You need to know what good looks like. Somebody has to provide context for you. You have to have time for repetitive practice, and you have to have learner safety. The repetitive practice I would offer up is really interesting, especially for engineers. For engineers, when we are under the pressure to get something delivered, we find the first one that works. If we can't compare at least 2 solutions for something that would work, then we really haven't learned anything. All we've learned is that this one works, but if we can't compare it and say, how is this one better? How is that one deficient? Then how do we know that we've actually learned and something that's applied, and how do we know how to address it going forward? There's our books on the topic. The left one is about the structure around the dojo and some of these 6-week initiatives and how we worked with teams. It's more structure based. The one on the right is really less about the structure and more around helping engineering teams and product teams learn in the context of their work. We go through a bunch of examples inside there. We go through things to look for. It's really meant to just be a series of ideas for people trying to help engineering teams learn, applicable in any context. With that, Dean and I have probably rambled on far too long. What questions do you all have?
Questions, comments, feel free to either type it in the chat or feel free to speak it up. Either one works. I love so many great ideas in this presentation. I love the idea of teams learning together, learning in the flow of work. So definitely resonates. So Renee says, what would you recommend when your director is resistant, but the VP brought you to make the change? So how do you sell this concept?
You want to start, Dean?
The thought that immediately came to my mind was start small. See if you can get a pilot team going with this approach. Or, we talked about the dojo model being a 6-week model. Maybe you don't start there. Maybe you start with a week-long effort. The time scale, the time scale still needs to be balanced with all 7 principles. And probably the one that comes to mind the quickest is the space for repetition. But just as an example, one of the teams we worked with, it was a group of front-end developers who knew JavaScript and React really well, and they wanted to learn how to build back-end services, and they wanted to learn the Kotlin programming language. And we were able, with the caveat that we asked all of them to at least go through a book or some kind of online course about Kotlin. So there's where the traditional training comes in. That was a precursor to a pretty intensive 8-hour-day, 1-week experience where we built a real backend service in Kotlin with a couple sort of co-coaches from the organization who had been developing Kotlin backend services. But by going through that together, and we use that software teaming model, by going through that together, people at the end of the week felt like they could then move on and write their own backend services in Kotlin. They definitely did not feel like that after going through the books or the courses that they went through prior to that, right? But that combination was pretty effective. And that's an example of a much smaller duration effort. The reason I went into so much detail on that is if you want to try these principles and come up with some kind of learning experience that is whole team that adheres to the 7 principles, a week-long effort is probably a much better place to start than asking for a longer duration and covering a lot more topics than the couple that we covered in that 1 week. I think hopefully in your organization, it's easy to get approval for a small experiment like that. I think that's the other suggestion we could give here is see if you can couch this in terms of experiments to try to improve learning. If your org is currently under the developer productivity banner, if you've got one of those programs, say, hey, here's an idea or an approach that fits in with our developer productivity initiatives.
There's a couple of ideas I'd want to throw in there. Time is always a constraint for every place we've been in, right? So nobody wants to say, we have plenty of time, take as much time as you want to learn. That usually is never the case. So similar to Dion's point, sometimes we have to ask for a little bit of time to start kind of proving things out, then we gain momentum, right? So that tends to be a kind of common approach. The disconnect in the question around if your director is resistant, but the VP brought you in to make a change. while we always are working with the teams themselves, one thing we will talk about is everybody seeing the same picture? Is everybody seeing the same reality? Typically, what happens is challenges manifest at the team level, whether they be bureaucratic or skill based or something else. And so we try and make sure everybody is seeing the same reality. Like, does everybody at the director level and the VP level understand the systems model, the causal loops that are happening that are influencing the teams? You want the teams to go faster, but the lower environments are not stable. So when they try and go faster, it actually makes the environments less stable, which then means they have less time because they're fixing the environments, and you have these kind of causal loops happening. And so what we start doing is we start creating causal models to make sure that the director and the VP are seeing things, so we can talk about the leverage points we're trying to do with education to make a difference. I'm not saying that is going to solve that disconnect, but in many organizations, people don't see the same reality. And so we're just trying to make sure, hey, are we seeing the same thing?
So start small, collect the data, prove the point, make sure everyone knows it has the same visibility. There's a question from John. How much hand holding is needed for coaches to ensure that the collaboration loops are happening consistently?
As I'm sure you can imagine, it varies team to team. I would say most teams that we work with honestly don't know how to collaborate well. And that's through no fault of their own. Frequently, the engineer will just say, "Here, watch me do it." So we do have to kind of have a heavy coaching hand early on, so we can talk about, hold on, this is how we're going to work through this. Here's why we want you to externalize your ideas. Here's how we're going to rotate. So we do have to set up some structure and have a heavy coaching hand early on. Typically, that doesn't last very long. People tend to get the cadence pretty quickly. Usually what might change is when we shift from one engineering capability to another, or an engineering capability to a product capability or a design capability, then we might have to reinforce it through coaching again. But typically it is a little heavier handed from a coaching perspective, because I just don't think teams are ready for, or naturally aware to do these types of situations.
Yeah, Namrata, you may have missed the section where we talked about software teaming or ensemble programming. That's a very effective way for cross-training. And one thing I didn't say about that, but I'll share this little anecdote, is that a team that we introduced that practice to, their engineering manager was really worried that output was going to go way down, right? Obviously, I'm going to get way less output in terms of my sprint velocity if people are working together in a group as opposed to all working individually on their own. Surprisingly, their cycle time went down. So how long it took to complete a story went way down. It actually improved by 90%. I know it sounds unrealistic, but it improved by 90%, and their velocity stayed the same. And the reasons for that, I think, can be summed up in that, particularly for teams that are doing like the Scrum flavor of Agile, the upfront syncing up around planning, like sprint planning and then the daily stand-ups, that's all very visible. The back end syncing up is invisible. And what I mean by that is, when teams have a pull request process, most often they're not tracking how long work sits waiting for someone to do a review, or how long it sits after someone has done a review before the first person comes back and incorporates their comments and changes. Even when the pull requests are flowing pretty quickly, there's still the fact that someone has written new code in a code base that you also work in, that you need to understand at some point when you run across it in the future. And there's going to be time for you to learn what happened in the code base that you were not part of creating. So there's all this resyncing work that's completely invisible. And with this particular team, a lot of that went away. If you think about pull requests, if the whole team is working on code together, we don't need any kind of pull request process. The whole team is continuously reviewing and giving input into what's being created. So all that time immediately goes away. I will be honest and share the sad part of this anecdote was this team wrote up an internal blog posting about their experience. For a period of a week, it was the #1 hit, most popular piece of content on their internal wiki, but it didn't really seem to change anything in terms of a bunch of other teams saying, we want to learn this approach to working.
Thanks, Ian. There's a question from Andrew about this philosophy of owning your own development, and how does that conflict with the approach of coaching for learning?
So what I would offer up is I think there's room for both, right? I don't think it's an either or. It's probably one of those where's the appropriate balance, and it's going to vary organization to organization. From what I've seen, when engineers kind of own their own development, they get excited about some very relevant topics that the organization may or may not want to go into, some directions they may or may not want to go. So you have that kind of risk. They tend to be more excited about it, and that's fine. I think what's more interesting is sometimes engineers don't know. I shouldn't say just engineers. It's really kind of anybody. Sometimes we don't know what we could learn. Like we don't know, like just because we haven't been exposed to it. For example, I have worked with teams that have done a lot of API, kind of consumption, but they never thought about the idea, or have never been exposed to the idea of contract tests or mocking services. And so if we think about if they were to own their own development, they might get really involved in API design or something like that, but they wouldn't understand other techniques that actually might make their job easier, or they might not think about. We do a lot of work actually with domain-driven design, and so I think that's the kind of risk, is that when we own our own development, we're only kind of privy to what's in front of us as opposed to kind of other ideas. And so that's why I think it's a balance. You definitely want to have your own motivation and your own desire for growth, but the idea with coaching for learning is trying to expose other concepts and other areas. Sometimes we start with like principles, like we never start with tools. We'll start with principles and then practices. We're trying to get better repeatability, better visibility. Here are some practices kind of in that space. Okay, now that we understand the practices, what are our options of things we could learn? Engineers tend to kind of, and most people when they do self-learning tend to fall further into that right side, where it's just like, what's the tool I could use, as opposed to like the practice I want to focus on.
Yep. Cool. I'm just checking the time. Any final questions from anybody? Also, I wanted to mention, I believe Dion and Joel, you're both on the Slack channel as well, right? In case that they want to reach you, or is there a better way to get in touch?
We are, and I will confess that I don't think either one of us did a good job of staying connected with the community after our last talk, but I promise to remedy that this time around. Both of us, yeah.
Got it. Cool. We love having you here. So we'll be following up also with the recording of this, and I believe slide deck, as well as a summary. So we'll make sure that everyone gets what happened today. If you have any questions, there's contact information for both Dion and Joel, and so feel free to reach out. And with that, thank you both. Great to see you again, and I always learn a lot from you sharing your experience working with all these teams. So thank you.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us, Marco. Thank you, everybody.